Short and sweet, sure. Welcome, Anita, and welcome all. It's such a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. I can't believe we're this far along in the colloque series already, but it's really full steam ahead today. So I can't wait for your talk, Anita. Looks absolutely fascinating. And just as a reminder, everybody, still a number of working group meetings coming up this week. And we will not be having, though, the regular research series this Wednesday. So just as a heads up, not to expect that. Otherwise, welcome. I look forward to a great discussion. Bill, thanks so much for moderating. And over to you, good sir.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody, and happy World Water Day. And apropos of World Water Day, our colloquium presenter just got done doing a presentation for World Water Day also. Today's colloquium presenter is Dr. Anita Milman, who is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And at UMass, Professor Milman is also an affiliated scholar with several centers and institutes, and engaged in a number of projects in collaboration with researchers at other universities as well. Having worked with Anita Millman for the last few years, I sometimes think I know what she's working on. But it turns out that Anita is one of those colleagues about whom any one of her many collaborators only see the tip of the iceberg. I was getting ready to introduce her today, so I did a little looking around at her recent work and discovered that in 2020 alone, she had articles published in Global Environmental Change, Environmental Science and Policy, Journal of Environmental Management, Environmental Research Letters, and 2 articles in Society and Natural Resources. Many of us would regard placing something in any one of those journals as a sign of a good year. And the topics ranged from international river basins to science policy interactions to a survey of wastewater utility managers on innovation and regulations. She's also PI on an NSF project on institutional arrangements and the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, about which you heard some on Michael Roberts' research series presentation on Wednesday last week. Anita is a visiting scholar of the Ostrom Workshop for this academic year, although the circumstances of which we are all aware have prevented her from being able to visit in person yet. Today we get to enjoy a virtual visit with her about one of her current works in progress. So please join me in welcoming today's colloquium speaker, Dr. Anita Millman.
Great. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. And thank you to the workshop for selecting me as a visiting fellow. Even though the pandemic has thwarted that, I do hope to come and visit and have some more time to talk with all of you. Thanks also for attending the seminar today so that we can celebrate World Water Day in its fullest. So today I want to talk with you about a project I've been working on related to interagency coordination in response to a top-down mandate. And I'm a bit ashamed, not fully, but a bit ashamed to admit that this project was motivated more by incredulity than by academic theory or broader impacts. So the impetus was California's 2014 Groundwater Sustainability Act, which people respond to fondly or not so fondly as SGMA. So when you hear me say SGMA today, I am talking about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And my desire was to see how this was going to play out. So my fascination with this topic led me to cold call Bill and say to him, hi, you've never met me, but you have an interest in groundwater and institutions. And while UMass has some funds for me to pay you to take a trip to Massachusetts if you read and provide me feedback on an NSF grant application. And Bill, being the nice guy that he is, he doesn't know how to say no to anything. So he came and somehow we conned the NSF into thinking this was a great idea. And a few years later, here we are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you what our fascination is with SGMA, what the law says and what is happening to implement it. And then I'll dive into our research questions and methods, and then I'll talk to you and spend the bulk of the time going through our findings and our implications. And then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time to get some feedback from you. So SGMA, what is it that made me so fascinated about it? Well, SGMA sets out for the first time the objective and the requirement that groundwater be sustainably managed across California. So this is not to say that prior to Sigma, there was no management of groundwater in California, but rather that groundwater was governed unevenly and through piecemeal approaches. And the result was significant groundwater depletion across a large number of groundwater basins. So for several decades, California had attempted to improve the management of groundwater, but it faced significant political pressures against any attempts to engage in a statewide approach. But the 2014 drought offered a sort of policy window, so to speak, that resulted in a negotiated outcome that we were going to retain local control over groundwater, albeit with substantially increased state level oversight. So the way Sigma works is any local agency or combination of agencies can decide whether or not they want to be part of implementation. So to do so, they decide whether or not to declare themselves and to form what is called a Groundwater Sustainability Agency, a GSA. So you'll hear me say GSA a lot. So opting in gave those agencies additional powers, but also substantial responsibilities. Opting out meant that some other agency in the basin was going to make decisions about groundwater on their behalf. Any public agency with prior land or water management authority could choose to become a GSA, and they could become a GSA on their own, or they could become a GSA by partnering with other organizations. The key was that they needed to cover the entire groundwater basin, and they needed to do so without overlap. So we might have one GSA covering the entire basin, or we might have multiple GSAs within a single basin. Step number 2 was that these GSAs then had to develop groundwater sustainability plans. So for these plans, there are fairly detailed requirements as to what needs to be included related to developing science and data and monitoring of the groundwater system, creating sustainability criteria. These had to be quantitative metrics of sustainability across 6 different characteristics of groundwater and negative impacts of groundwater. And they had to include sets of projects and management actions that would help to achieve or ensure achievement of these sustainability actions. There needed to be monitoring and data management, and then a number of other requirements related to reporting, considerations of ecosystems, and public involvement. So agencies opting into this have a fair amount of choice. Your plan can be in any scope. So if you are a single GSA covering the entire basin, you might just create a single groundwater sustainability plan, a GSP. But even if you have multiple GSAs within a basin, well, you could decide to work together to form a joint GSP that covers the entire basin. Or you could create your own GSP, but if there are multiple GSPs that are created within the basin, the law requires coordination. And coordination had to cover certain aspects, including a consistent hydrogeologic conceptual model, compatible sustainability criteria, shared data and comprehensive monitoring, and then some sort of demonstration of how implementations of projects and management actions jointly or separately would together lead to sustainability at the basin level. So in other words, under Sigma, agencies have to coordinate, but they can choose to coordinate however they like, as long as the end result is basin-wide sustainability. Now, here's where the law also then puts in the backstop, the or else, which is failure to do so will lead to state intervention and state management fees. So this means if agencies in these basins do not adequately plan for their groundwater sustainability, not only is the State Water Resource Control Board going to come in and manage their groundwater for them, they're going to charge them a management fee, which is not inconsequential. So you will have to pay for somebody else to manage your groundwater and tell you what to do with it. So I think this is fascinating. In fact, I will say that all of my colleagues that spend time talking with me about it say we think it is as good as a soap opera watching this whole process unfold. So this leads us to our research questions. We knew we wanted to understand what was happening under Sigma, and we had to figure out what we were going to ask about it. So interagency coordination is not exactly understudied. In fact, it's been a topic of consideration for quite some time, and there are a number of theories that address how agencies relate to one another. We've got rational choice theory, transaction cost theory, agency care theory. We're talking about agencies working together. Perhaps the most well-known is the institutional collective action framework, but there are many other theories that exist. Notably about them, though, most theories and studies that examine interagency relationships are looking at those that are entered into, or in some cases not entered into, voluntarily. So under a top-down mandate, we expect that this calculus is going to change. And so our research is focusing on this dynamic of mandated coordination. And specifically what we're asking is, when coordination is mandatory, but how to coordinate is discretionary, what approaches do agencies take to coordination and why? And then we're asking, in what ways does attainment of the objectives of mandated coordination vary with the coordination approach adopted? And subsequently, this leads us to trying to understand, well, under what conditions is a top-down mandate that allows discretion effective? So today I'm only going to talk to you about the first of these, this question about what approaches to coordination do agencies adopt and why. But I do want to point out that we do have the so what, which is the study on whether or not these differing approaches lead to equivalent forms of coordination, as a paper that is in works. And so we will have an answer to how does the coordination approach adopted matter coming up next. Okay, so our research is focusing on what are known as the critically overdrafted basins. If you notice in my first slide, I showed that there were 134 groundwater basins under SGMA that have to respond to this law. 19 of those basins have to go first, and they had to have their groundwater sustainability plans developed by January of 2020. So they are the focus of our basin. And within these, 234 agencies decided to participate by forming GSAs. Now, some collaboration across them occurred, and they formed 96 GSAs. And then those 96 GSAs formed 44 different groundwater sustainability plans. So we can start to understand the differing coordination approaches that are being happening just by looking at this. So if we wanted to understand what coordination approaches are they taking and why, we needed to dig deep in to understand their decision-making processes and find out what the considerations they had were when they were making their decisions. So to do this, we collected substantial data through interviews, through participant observation, through meeting minutes and secondary materials, through a review of coordination agreements, and through lots and lots of analysis through qualitative coding. So here's where I want to give a special shout out to my collaborators, and a special to Michael, who gave an excellent presentation at the Awesome Research Seminar last week and spent several months while driving around California begging people to talk with him. And to Amber, who somehow stayed sane while reading through hundreds of legal coordination agreements. Also thanks to Bill, because Bill is Bill. No, Bill actually was very useful in this as well. Okay, so to begin with, we needed to understand the considerations of agencies as they weighed how to coordinate under SGMA. So interviewees had a lot to say about this, and there was also a lot of discussion and deliberation during public meetings on this topic. This slide depicts the main categories of concerns in our data. As you've got a copy of the paper and we've limited time, I'm not going to go into detailed explanations and definitions of each of these categories of concerns, but I do want to explain that we came up with these categories through an iterative process, that there are some categorizations of concerns about coordination in the literature, but most of the literature lumps together the concerns into broad speaking categories. And most of the literature isn't necessarily paying attention to, as I mentioned before, the role of a mandate and the way that agencies' concerns are structured around what they think the mandate is asking for them. So for example, the ICA framework, which I referred to earlier, is very hand-waving in terms of how it addresses autonomy. And in terms of the mandate, well, we think that this adds to, or we saw actually, that this adds to concerns a lot of considerations of performance, both outcome, which is, are we achieving sustainability, as well as compliance, which is, are we doing what the law is asking us to do, or will the state intervene? We also are finding that lock-in was a big concern, which was not at all addressed in any of the literature that we've read. And so by lock-in, we're looking at how coordination limits the ability of agencies, or limits the options ability to agencies in the future. So we don't have data on the concerns of every single agency. There were 234 of them, but our data do help us to understand how these concerns combine and vary from agency to agency. And one thing that we saw was happening in terms of concerns combining is that we saw that autonomy concerns and divisional concerns often occur in tandem, and that autonomy concerns and lock-in concerns also occur in tandem, often not at the same time though. We didn't necessarily see agencies with divisional concerns also having lock-in concerns, although some of them we did. We also see that there's some tensions within concerns, such as concerns about being in compliance being in tension with concerns about autonomy, because there was concerns about being able to make your own decision versus whether or not you are coordinating sufficiently for the state to see you as coordinated. This concept of compliance, I actually think we need to pay particular attention to it. It's not unsurprising that it plays an important role. There's a vast literature on policy implementation that talks about how perceptions of what is required by a mandate influences the way the street level bureaucrats that are in charge with implementation respond. But we do see that the varying opinions and understandings of what they think is required to be in compliance weigh into the coordination decisions. And I'll explain that more in a little bit. Okay, so in terms of how to address these concerns, well, agencies have a lot of options as to how to coordinate, and each of these different options offers differing protections and trade-offs in terms of how they address autonomy and the concerns about the risks of coordination. So these choices are related to GSA formation, GSP, oh, it should say GSP development here, sorry about that, and GSP coordination, so development of your agency, development of your groundwater sustainability plan, and then if there are multiple plans in the basin, how you're going to coordinate across those plans. And then within any of these, if there are multiple agencies involved, there are also decisions about governance within the partnership related to representation, decision-making rules, ratification of decisions, no effect clauses. So these are specific call outs to what the agreement does not have any power or control over, exit and termination clauses, and financial commitments. So the table in the paper that you see is a first attempt at trying to then trace and track the relationship between these coordination mechanisms and the different concerns and protections that they provide. So this is actually a little bit of a challenging process because you might have a choice that is addressing, so a coordination mechanism that's being used is going to address multiple concerns at the same time. And it doesn't necessarily directly intend to have that impact. It may actually just by default have that impact. So I do want to talk a little bit through, not at the moment, but with anybody that's interested, the relationship between, say, decisions about whether or not to create your GSP separately than your GSA or jointly affects differing aspects of agency concerns. We see this most often in some questions about decision rules and ratification of decisions, because there are some times in which, even though they work jointly together, the veto power goes all the way back down to the agency, which means that the fact that they're working together is really still quite a strongly autonomous process. In any case, looking across what agencies actually did, we see a vast amount of variation. So I'm showing you a flow chart that shows it aggregated by options. I know it's very small. I'm working on figuring out how to make this more presentable. It shows basically the differing steps of choices that agencies had as they chose to make a GSA, then they chose to make a GSP, and then coordinate across GSPs. And if you look at Appendix A in the paper, which really delineates the full range of options that agencies chose, we saw that there were actually more than 30 different pathways that agencies chose. So 30 different combinations of coordination mechanisms that were put into place. Now, the most notable of those were agencies that joined the process, so they became a GSA, but they fully ceded their authority to other agencies. So I formed a GSA, but another agency is going to make all of the decisions for me. Then there are, of course, the agencies that took some control for those seeding agencies, which are very interesting. And lastly, I think some of the most interesting agency choices are those that chose to remain completely and entirely dependent, forming their own GSA and their own GSP, and having full control over the decisions across the entire process. Now, what was most interesting to us is not so much the individual agency choices, but how the choices across all the agencies in the basin aggregate and end up looking like as a result of these choices. Because it's not just the requirement of sustainability at the basin level. There are multiple agencies in each basin. So it's not just a question of pairwise, how do you coordinate, but it's a combination of how as a whole do the agencies then structure their relationships with the many other agencies in the basin. So when we look across our 19 basins, we see that there were 6 structures that appeared across the basins. I won't quite say that they're evenly distributed, but they're close to evenly distributed across the basin. And these are quite interesting. So the top three all have some form of centralized structure. So the first one here, I've got centralized with fully integrated decisions. This is where agencies came together to jointly form a single GSA that covered the entire basin. And then that GSA created a plan for the entire basin. So very, very integrated process for making decisions within the basin. The next step down in terms of less centralization is what I call centralized with devolution of implementation. So this is very similar to the first category, except that agencies, even though they were working together, still retained the ability to choose their own projects for implementation. I'll talk to you about why each of these in a few minutes. So these two are very, very integrated and centralized at the basin level. The next option, C, centralized, here I call it one dominant party, but I believe in the text I called it exit options, is also quite centralized, but it's centralized in a different way. Here, in the case, there are multiple GSAs that formed, but one of those GSAs is taking on responsibility for the entire basin. So you would almost liken it to being similar to the others in that there's a centralized structure for decision making in the basin, except that it's not all of the agencies working together in those decisions. It's this single agency that is making, or this dominant GSA, it's not always a single agency, is making the decisions for the basin. And these other GSAs are kind of standing off in the back line, but they have the option at a later point, if they want to form their own GSPs. And so there's this exit option available, which is if for whatever reason, we don't want to continue to participate in this joint structure through the single GSP, they can create their own GSP and make it a multiple GSP basin. Okay, so if those are our centralized structure, then we get more into our fragmented structures. And on the bottom left, I've got regionalized with defined performance targets. So these are an interesting set of basins where there were a lot of agencies together, and they basically divided up and portioned out the basin. And they said, you will have this portion of the basin, you will have this portion of the basin, and we will agree across us how much of sustainable yield is yours, and you need to manage and achieve that target. So this is a way of being very concrete about responsibilities without having to join together and make joint decisions. The regionalized but strongly independent basins are similar in that they're forming multiple groundwater sustainability plans across the basin. The difference being that they're lacking that degree of coordination where they are building up and specifying how much of the yield and setting clear performance targets for each of the agencies in the basin. And then lastly, we get to what I'm calling the formalization of the status quo basins. So at the outset, these may seem like these are centralized because there are multiple agencies working together to create a single groundwater sustainability plan. The difference being that there is very little joint decision making that is occurring in these basins, and that the plan itself sets out the fact that each GSA is going to operate very independently in choosing its projects and its management actions. Also notably, when you read through the text of what those agencies are planning, they are not planning to do much beyond what they were already planning to do. And so I'm calling it formalization of the status quo because they're coming together to form something that looks like they are strongly coordinating, and yet at the same time, they are mostly agreeing that each of them will do what each of them chooses to do. Okay, so that's the governance structures that were the result. And the question is, well, how does this relate to the concerns of different agencies? So I tried to find a way to depict this visually to match it with that picture, but it's actually quite difficult to do that. So instead what I've done is I've grouped together in white, gray, white, gray, white, gray, the basins that fit each of these different categories. And then as you look across here, you can see the extent of concerns that they expressed about their considerations when they were making decisions about how to go about coordinating. And so the top three here are all our centralized ones. And if you compare them to our bottom three, even just visually looking at this table, we can see that there are a lot fewer concerns about autonomy as well as about coordination risks. But even when we look within these, there's some interesting notes to think about. So within our centralized but integrated decision-making basins, there's a few concerns here and there, but what's interesting is that these basins had few surface water rights and some limited groundwater management in existence prior to Sigma. There were definitely some groundwater management, but there were very few irrigation agencies, and there wasn't much to lose in terms of autonomy because there weren't agencies that were set up with strong water management regimes in place to begin with. And so by coordinating, they weren't necessarily going to lose their decision-making competencies that they've been using previously. So they have some variation here in terms of their other considerations. Our centralized with devolution of implementation, this is only one basin. This is the Santa Cruz Mccounty Basin. In many ways, it's quite similar to the others. We've got them having a little bit of concern here. What makes them special is, well, number one, they're Santa Cruz. And number two is that they are dealing with seawater intrusion as their primary concern, and that their agencies were already engaged in acting in seawater barriers, and so they wanted to continue those actions, and they thought that it would be more effective for their agencies to act independently in those. So it was not a decision about concerns about autonomy or coordination risks so much as it was concerns about the effectiveness of their actions. Okay, then we get to our centralized with exit options. And these are the ones here where a single GSA is taking responsibility for most of the basin. And this is interesting too, because in these basins, particularly in the Pleasant Valley, Oxon or West Side basins, there was basically one agency that existed prior to Sigma that is the largest percentage of the basin. And the other agencies in the basin only cover a very small segment of the basin. So they are some reasonable ways in which we might expect that having that major agency be in charge is the most effective and efficient for everybody. The 180-400 foot aquifer is a joint multi-agency GSA, and it would have actually made its way into the centralized with integrated decision-making basins had there not been some very small players that wanted to be independent, mostly in a dispute about a desalination water plant. We then get to our regionalized basins, and this is where I think it's quite interesting when we look at the differences between the regionalized with coordinated performance targets and those that were regionalized with strong independence. And that the regionalized with coordinated performance targets, this is where they allocated yield across GSAs within the basin. In many cases, these basins had a strong case of the haves versus the have-nots in terms of who had surface water and who did not have surface water. And those that had surface water did not want to be responsible for making up for pumping for those that did not have surface water, which is why we see very strong divisional concerns along with the decision-making competencies. So there's a similar dynamic in the regionalized with strong independence. And someone wonder, well, why didn't they come up with performance targets? And I think what we see going on here is that in these regionalized with strong interdependence or strong independence, there was one agency that very much did not want to work with any of the other agencies. It strongly felt that it was going to just manage its own groundwater within its area. And that was its motivation for being an independent agency. Now, another thing that we see happening in both these basins, and I know I'm going to wrap up very soon, that's very interesting in terms of performance considerations and coordination risks is that in the regionalized with coordination performance tests, most of these agencies had the perspective that if the state was going to intervene, it was only going to intervene in a portion of the basin. And so by having these performance targets, they were able then to demonstrate, or they might be able to demonstrate, this is hypothetical, of course, because the state hadn't made the decisions yet. They felt that the state would only intervene in the unsustainable portions of the basin, and that in some ways these performance targets could help to justify that concern. Lastly, we have these formalization of the status quo basins that I was talking about. And what's interesting when you look at these ones is that they actually seem to have fewer risks associated with them in terms of their explanation of concerns. And I want to point out how this very closely relates to the structure of they've agreed to coordinate in forming a single plan, but within that plan, they each have their own abilities to make decisions. And this is where coordination doesn't prevent or does not represent a significant risk if the coordination isn't actually going to be an agreement to do anything jointly. So you're not going to be worried about divisional, well, they are worried about divisional concerns, but the way they dealt with this in terms of divisional concerns is just by saying, well, we're going to look like we're coordinated, but we're basically going to each be our independent entities within that. And each of them then was going to choose to pursue their own ongoing options as how they were going to achieve groundwater sustainability. There's a little bit of a variation across these basins that I can talk about at a later point too. So in summary, what we're seeing is that agencies have multiple concurrent concerns about coordination. I mean, I think this is clear when we look at this diagram and you see that there's multiple columns that are filled out here. And as I mentioned earlier, autonomy, lock-in, and compliance are particularly relevant for mandated coordination. But I also want to point out that it's this combination of concerns that itself helps to determine which direction you are going. So you've got it as an agency when you're making decisions, you're looking at the trade-offs between how it might contribute to one risk versus another risk. We're also seeing that concerns influence the selection of coordination mechanisms, but they're not the only determinant, that there are other factors involved. It's not just the risks, but perhaps it's partly the benefits and partly some of the other relationships that exist within the basin. And I want to point out again that the collective concerns of agencies determine the new form of governance structure. So it's not just one agency's concern, but it's the group agencies of concern. And that goes back to if we look at our regionalized but strongly independent, one agency, the one that was not willing to coordinate or work with others, really did help set the stage for the fact that they were never going to be able to have a fully integrated basin. And lastly, I want to point out that agencies can coordinate by not agreeing to change very much. So you can coordinate nominally or de jure without actually coordinating very strongly in action. So that's a brief overview, and it is very overviewy, and that I'm generally doing a little bit of hand waving and over simplifying of some of the dynamics that are happening within these basins. That is part of the goal of this, in that we're looking for something that's generalizable and transferable. But the nuance within each basin is fascinating and a soap opera in and of its own right. What I'd love to hear from you is really your overall reactions and suggestions, and whether or not this is compelling in the narrow focus on concerns versus choices. As I mentioned, we've got another paper that's looking at outcomes in terms of coordination versus choices, but putting those all into single paper is really quite complicated and a lot of, it's going to be quite lengthy. And the other thing is that I'm doing the switching between agencies and agency level decisions and basin level decisions. And this is because, again, the group dynamics is what we think is very important. It's also something that's not very well addressed in the literature, because most of the time the studies of interagency coordination are looking at relationships between one agency and another agency, and not about how choices across groups of agencies interact with one another. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And with that, I will turn the microphone away from me and open up for questions.
Thanks, Anita. And again, just to reiterate, you can use the raise hand function, or you can just type in the chat that you have a question or a comment, and I will moderate the lineup. And Jess Steinberg has a couple of questions for you to get us started, Anita.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and thanks, Anita. This was fascinating and an impressive amount of work from you and the co-authors. So well done. So I have a couple of questions, and I will try to keep them brief to kick off the conversation. The first is more just a contextual question, which is you began your conversation to sort of say, look, most of the literature hasn't really looked at mandated coordination. And so I'm curious if you have a sense of the sort of prevalence of mandated coordination either at the state level or the national level? In other words, what is the universe of cases that you think that this could speak to, if especially you're going to get to your third question at some point in another paper about comparing mandated versus voluntary. So that's my first question. The second question is related to that and has to do with whether you could imagine a situation in which mandated coordination reduces costs instead of, right? So it's sort of more intuitive that it would increase costs because you have compliance costs and reporting, right, under a mandate that you might not have under voluntary compliance or voluntary coordination. So I'm curious, though, whether there's any circumstance in which you could imagine mandated coordination reducing costs instead of increasing them. And then my third question gets to the last point that you made in your presentation. And that has to do with like how you are thinking about the aggregation of individual level choices and preferences to collective outcomes at the either the GSA or the Basin level, right? So one could imagine an individual agency like making particular negative decisions that then sort of shape whether there's like, you know, like I don't want anybody else to have control over this, right? Or I want to make sure that we retain some level of autonomy, or I'm worried about lock-in, right? And that sort of takes them out of the game in some way as a coordinating group with lots of others, right? I guess it's not clear to me what kinds of individual preferences, like how they match with other individual preferences to yield the outcome, the collective outcomes that we're looking at here. And I'm not entirely sure how we would get at that exactly, but it strikes me as you've you've all this wonderful information in this chart about sort of the kinds of preferences expressed at the Basin level that correspond to these different coordination outcomes. But I'm still, I don't have a good sense of either a theory or a proposed mechanism by which we get from individual preference and choices to these collective outcomes given, like in other words, which ones win out, how many have to prefer a particular thing to get this particular collective coordinative outcome. I'm going to stop talking. That last question, I'm happy to clarify further if it wasn't clear what I was asking, but also a fascinating conversation.
Great. Those are all really, really good questions, and they are interesting. That last one, I would love to have a long conversation on, but okay. First, in terms of the prevalence of mandated coordination, it's actually more and more prevalent as we go. There's a number of times in which higher levels of government, it happens in school districts, it happens in healthcare systems, it happens often in water, where in many ways, and also in emergency services, where higher levels of government are talking to lower levels of government and saying that they need to coordinate. Now, often what happens is there are a number of different ways in which this can happen. Sometimes it can be discretionary as to how to coordinate, which is where we are looking at. And the purpose of this was to specifically address your second question, which is agencies know what's going to be best for them and it's going to reduce their costs. So let them choose rather than forcing them to a structure that may not be effective for them, either from an economic perspective or a political perspective. So we're looking at discretionary coordination. There is discretion within a mandate. There are a number of mandates which are less discretionary, where there may be a state level agency that brings agencies together in a collaborative forum, which is often called a hierarchical network, where they're being led through a coordination process. And then there are other times in which mandates may have some degree of how you must coordinate, but less degree on others. So I don't have a percentage or a quantitative number of this, but I can say that the reason there's been a lot of attention to this is, or to the issue of mandated coordination is sort of growing in the academic literature, is because I think this is going to be a new wave. In Europe, they call it the new public management, and they talk about joined up government, and it's really about how do we overcome this fragmentation problem. So I think it is, and there are going to be comparisons, and there already are comparisons, even though I'm not giving you a concrete example right now. In terms of mandation as reducing costs, well, I think that part of the idea behind it is that by encouraging agencies to work together, they will develop economies of scale and address their externalities in ways that may be more efficient than if we tell them how to mandate. And so rather than letting them take charge and undertake the coordination that's required, the state would do it for them. And that leads to a whole different level of costs, right? Because it's just shifting of costs, which is who is paying the cost of the coordination. Is it the state that's going to pay the cost, or is it the local level that as they coordinate? And I think the idea is that this decentralized method will be less costly in terms of time, in terms of money, and in terms of politics. I don't know, there's probably people that have studied this. I don't know the answer to that one either. And your last question about the aggregation of collective choices, that is a question that we have deliberated over. We do not have a solid theory on this, but I can give you a number of examples where, number one, there are some agencies that have less voice in the basin, and so their collective decision-making or their coordination decision-making choices don't really come into consideration, because it's the big players in the basin, the more powerful are the larger ones that are actually determining what the structure of the basin is going to be. What we've seen often is that when agencies are forming either a joint GSA or joint GSP, it's because they have either good working relationships, because they have similarities with one another relative to differences with others in the basin. And so by working together collaboratively, they're hoping to influence their bargaining position within the basin, or because they're geographically co-located in ways that makes it impossible for them not to work together. So that's, I think, where we get back to this other statement. Oh, you're not seeing my slides right now, where these concerns are important, but there's other factors that are at work, and how those aggregate up is, there are patterns, but we don't have enough, I think, even with 19 basins to come up with a conclusive answer for you.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks, Jess. The queue as it stands right now is Mike, then Brian, then Tom. So Mike McGinnis, it's yours.
Hey, thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks, Anita, for an interesting talk. Can you guys hear me? All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One of the things I was interested in, first I want to respond to your question about whether it's okay to shift between the basin and the agencies. I think that's absolutely essential for the project that you're doing. You've kind of got to do that, and you've got a nice set of well-defined regions here, which makes it a little easier for you to treat each of those as a unit. And I know some people are going to bitch about moving units, levels of analysis and stuff like that, but I think it's absolutely essential for what you're doing. But what I found fascinating is your set of 6 different governance systems, different types of governance systems that these groups select based on your measures of their costs and benefits and the challenges or the costs they're going to face. But I'm curious about an over time question of how many of these are changing. You mentioned a few examples where they've changed, and I would be interested in seeing if you've got enough data yet in sense of whether they're learning from their previous decisions as they need to make a change in their organizational structure, or if they're learning from their neighbors. You just mentioned the geographic connections, and so there's going to be some. I know they're in separate regions, but they're going to have some other circumstances where they're interacting with each other. There's going to be some opportunities for diffusion across these networks. So how much have you looked into the dynamic changes within a region, and then sort of generation of patterns and cross effects in the state system as a whole?
Yeah, so this is something we've talked about a good amount, and I would say that I fully expect that there will be changes, that the cost of implementation will either drive agencies to work together, or looking at their options in terms of projects that they can jointly implement together, or disagreements that are kind of simmering will blow up. There have been a lot of lawsuits filed already. So I do think that there will be changes in the governance structures. Whether or not, well, your question is how much have we seen that happen? So I will reiterate that the plans were only due in January of 2020. And so they've only just gotten through the first round. But every 5 years, they have to update the plans. They have to evaluate how well they are doing towards their target, and they have to develop new plans. And so I expect that in this 5-year update, when they're developing new plans, is where either they realize that their past plans needed some major updates where it works more sense for them to work jointly together, or where they're going to just, having now gotten the expertise that is developed by figuring out how to put together one of these plans in the first place, they will then decide to go on it on their own. So I think the answer to your question is I will answer your question in 5 years, because by then we will definitely be able to track where changes are happening and start to try to understand why.
Fair enough, thanks.
Plus, I'll just add to what Anita said, plus the N is about to expand dramatically, because this is a study of that first round of the critically overdrafted basins that had the first set of deadlines. And there is a whole other and larger batch of basins where the GSAs are subject to deadline in 2022 to get their GSPs together. So we're going to have a wave of additional GSAs and GSPs to look at soon. And then they'll also be subject to those 5-year cycles of updating and reporting that Anita was talking about. So the number of GSAs who will be able to look at other GSAs and see what's going on, as well as, you know, reflect on their own experience, is about to get a whole lot bigger, and that'll be interesting in its own way. So thanks, Mike. I've got Brian and then Tom.
Okay, really nicely done presentation, neat stuff, makes a lot of sense. What I'm going to ask about, I guess, might be something for a separate paper or whatever. The paper, the parts of it I read, it didn't get all of it, is all about agencies and basically seems to treat them as pretty unitary. And so, you know, in Ostrom workshop or whatever, I don't see any political entrepreneurs, or in slightly similar terminology, risk takers, people who would be creating deviation either, you know, that risk-taking way or other kinds, like presumably their boards, county commissions, which one might think get politicized, and people are doing things out of political motives. So if you can say whether you're seeing any things that might explain things, either are all these people so well socialized that agencies act as units, or are you seeing things that go beyond this kind of agency level of explanation? I have another question maybe for later. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Great. Yes, so I know you were present on Wednesday of last week when Michael talked about some of his analysis of the differing dynamics within counties. So counties form a sort of portion there. I'm going to make a rough estimate that there may be about 30. Michael, you know how many counties there are involved in this, but there's I lose track, but probably about 30 of the agencies and that are involved in Sigma are counties. And so you can start to think about the dynamics within a county within that. But even outside of the counties, individuals within agencies are definitely playing an important role. We are aggregating here to the agency level based on what our interviewees and what we are attributing as the generalized concern of that agency. Now, within that, there may be some entities within an agency that are more concerned about autonomy and others that are more concerned about compliance, for example. That is absolutely true. And we have decided at this point, in part because of the depth of data, the collection that we need to do to actually be able to get that, and the difficulty of even reaching the number of agents that we did, that getting that information would be challenging. So we've contacted multiple representatives to talk about their agencies, and we've looked through public meetings and watched the dynamics, and we've sat through a number of public meetings. But yes, how the decision making within an agency works out is not something that we have huge amounts of detail on. In terms of entrepreneurs, there are entrepreneurs, and they do go around trying to sway other agencies, right? So we've got examples of that, both in terms of ones that are lobbying for groundwater banking and trying to convince everybody in the basin that part of their plan should include groundwater banking. But we also had that even earlier in terms of entities and agencies that were trying to get people in the basin to all work together. So we've got a number of basins in which one agency in the basin, and led by one person or maybe two people in that agency, really tried to convince the basin to create a single groundwater sustainability agency and or a single groundwater sustainability plan. Or we have instances where within an agency, they were perhaps leaning towards that option, and the lawyer came out and had a strong viewpoint that they should not form a single GSA or a single or join together with others in the groundwater sustainability plan, and convince them that the risk of that was too high. So these intra-agency dynamics are indeed an important determinant of what the agency's overall outcome was.
Thank you. Tom Kuntz, you're up.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks, Anita. This is really interesting. And I haven't learned much about this process yet, but I know lots of cool things are happening. I just was thinking about your question you just posed about whether it's sort of enough to have a paper about these concerns and these types. And my question is pretty simple. Are you trying to establish a causal arrow here, like type of concern somehow leads to their chosen coordination structure? Or is it the other way around? The chosen coordination structure leads them to have these kind of concerns. Is that something that you've thought about, if there's a causal arrow, and like which way it goes?
So we are definitely looking in our causal direction from type of concern to chosen coordination structure. Now, in the interviews and talking to people, once you've got your chosen coordination structure, clearly that then can serve to magnify or reduce some of your concerns about that. As going through the process of, we had these concerns at the outset, and then we started developing our groundwater sustainability plan, and halfway through plan development, we changed our mind about what we're most concerned about. So there is this reciprocity between the two. We have very explicitly, in characterizing our concerns and characterizing the choices, looked through our data to look at sort of ex ante a priori concerns, just to try to be very, very careful about what directionality we're looking at.
Great, thanks. I think this is important because we have a context in people's thought processes and constraints and all of that, that maybe leads them to deliberately choose something, some structure. And then from the structure should flow some of your other questions about what happens, given that the context will still also have another arrow going to that as well. But I like this kind of setting up sort of in order how things play out, and it sounds like a reasonable approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Michael Dwyer, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Anita. Anita and I are old friends. We went to grad school together way back when. And so I love the paper. I know a bit about Sigma from having just lived in California for a decade and a half and interacted with people who were trying to facilitate some of those basin level conversations back during the formation of the GSAs. And I wanted to ask if you would talk a little bit about the way that agribusiness comes into or doesn't come into the research. Because when I think of, why were those counties chosen, I think, well, agribusiness. That's why, as far as I know, those are the critically overdrafted places where Sigma is starting. And so in many ways, the formal dimensions of this study are about the public agencies, but the political economic players behind a lot of the story are private, are sort of a different form of entrepreneurs to what Brian was talking about. But the actual private sector companies that are involved in dealing with groundwater in so many ways, whether it's using them locally or transferring them via surface water compensation, all this stuff that makes up water politics in the Central Valley. And so I wondered if you could talk about that either in the ways that it creeps into the interview data that you all did, or in the ways that it sort of awkwardly stays out of it. I work in a very different political and economic context, but when I talk to regulators and public agencies, I sort of have to heavily triangulate what they tell me about what they do and try to look for what's going on in the private sector behind the scenes as well. So I figured there was an agribusiness story here in some way, and I wanted you to tell what you could.
Oh, there's more than one agribusiness story. Do not fear, we are in California Central Valley. There are multiple agribusiness involvements here. What I do want to point out as a starting point is that even though these are public agencies, they are many of them are actually far from what would be considered public, right? So they're public in that they have been set up either as a water irrigation district or a special ash district or other things. Some of these agencies, clearly a county or municipal water supplier, are extremely public in terms of how they are operated, how they are run, how they're set up. A lot of our irrigation districts, though, are not so much in that way. They have their own board of directors. Their board of directors is made up by participants that are elected to their board, and who gets to elect the board are, well, the people that are receiving water from these irrigation districts. And so some of our public agencies here are actually 100% controlled by, some of them are small, some of them are large in terms of geographic scope or revenues or water use, but only have 3 users. And those 3 users may be, for example, a very large agribusiness. And so this has actually been a big concern. In fact, I had a call from somebody in a county once that was very, very worried about what was happening in the decision making in their basin, because they really thought that it was private entities dividing up the basin to benefit themselves. And so the role of the agribusiness is within there. They have power dynamics within the play, and it's sort of a hidden, not so hidden way of actually making them part of the public process, particularly when they have control over certain agencies. Now, that being said, as sort of a hint towards the power dynamics within certain basins, there's also some backlash against that, which happens because there are a number of agencies that are not pleased about this, and the counties have a particular role that I didn't go into within this, but counties have the first choice, in some ways the last choice, about becoming a groundwater sustainability agency, because they have the land control where there may not be an irrigation district. And so counties themselves can choose to align with these businesses, or counties can say, well, we are very concerned about the other water users in the basin, and because we are part of a groundwater sustainability agency, or because we are formed our own over a portion of it, and you have to coordinate with us, we'll exercise our power in order to protect landowners. Now, some agencies that are doing that, and others that are, it depends on what they see the role of the county, and also what direction they want the county to go in terms of groundwater use. So I will say, in terms of coordination, I'll leave it there. And then I'll say, in terms of actual implementation, this gets a lot into what projects and management actions are decided upon, whether or not they're going to allow export of groundwater, or how they're going to decide to set up allocations or groundwater banking schemes. Very much depends on the dynamics of who are the actors, public and private, within each basin.
That does it for our queue. And since we are at just almost at 1 o'clock, I think what we will do at this point is, as regular colloquium attendees know, we formally adjourn at 1 o'clock. So if you have to go at 1 o'clock, you obviously should just feel free to leave the meeting. We often ask our speakers whether they're willing to stay on a little bit longer, and we leave the Zoom link open so that people who can and want to hang around a little bit longer can follow up with the presenter, or just engage in conversation within the group. So I think that rather than try to squeeze one more question in at this point, what I'll do is, on behalf of Scott, who had to step away, I will call us formally adjourned at this point. Please join me in thanking Anita Millman for our presentation today. Yes, indeed. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. And if you can hang around, we'll be happy to have you.
And if you can't hang around, but you have want to continue the conversation, either about my research or about yours, reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk.